In the endless expanse of the Mojave Desert, a dying lion looked into the eyes of a broken veteran and did something that defied every law of nature. Something so profound it would restore a man's faith in life itself. But let me start from the beginning, because this story begins not with a roar, but with silence. The sun hung mercilessly over the Nevada desert as former Marine Staff Sergeant David Reeves stepped out of his weathered trailer, another sleepless night etched into the lines of his weathered face. 3 years had passed since his last deployment in Afghanistan. 3 years since the roadside bomb that took his squad and left him with shrapnel scars and memories that refused to fade. The VA doctors called it survivor's guilt, prescribed pills that dulled the edges but never erased the images that played behind his closed eyelids every night. This remote outpost, 40 miles from the nearest town of Barstow, had become his sanctuary and his prison. David worked as a solar panel maintenance technician for a renewable energy company, a job that required long stretches of solitude in the unforgiving desert landscape. The isolation suited him. No crowds, no unexpected noises, no well-meaning civilians asking about his service with that particular mix of curiosity and pity in their eyes. His morning routine was as rigid as military protocol. Black coffee from a dented metal cup, equipment check, weather report crackling through the old radio, and then the long drive across dirt roads to reach the solar installations scattered across thousands of acres of scrubland. The desert was honest in its harshness. It didn't pretend to care about human problems, didn't offer false comfort or empty platitudes. Here, survival was simple. Respect the environment or it would kill you. As David loaded his truck with tools and water bottles, the familiar weight of his service weapon rested against his hip, a habit he couldn't break, a reminder of vigilance that had kept him alive in hostile territories. The morning air was still cool, but he knew that within hours the temperature would climb past 110 degrees, turning metal surfaces into branding irons and making every breath feel like inhaling fire. He had no way of knowing that this particular morning would shatter his self-imposed exile and force him to confront not just his own demons, but the desperate plea of a creature whose very presence in this desert was impossible. The first indication that something was wrong came at mile marker 47, where David's truck crested a rocky ridge and the vast solar array spread out below like a geometric constellation against the red earth. But instead of the usual pristine rows of panels catching the morning light, he saw something that made him slam on the brakes so hard that dust clouds engulfed the vehicle. A massive form lay sprawled between two solar panel rows, golden fur unmistakable even from a distance. David's combat-trained eyes immediately cataloged the impossibility of what he was seeing: an African lion, easily 400 pounds, motionless in the middle of the Nevada desert. His mind raced through rational explanations. Heat-induced hallucination, escaped circus animal, elaborate hoax. But as he grabbed his binoculars and focused on the creature, the reality became undeniable. The lion was real, and it was dying. David's hands trembled as memories of Afghanistan flooded back. The countless times he'd approached potentially dangerous situations, never knowing if what lay ahead was friend, foe, or trap. But this was different. This was an apex predator in a place where no apex predator should exist. Thousands of miles from its natural habitat, somehow surviving in one of North America's most inhospitable environments. Through the binoculars, he could see the lion's rib cage rising and falling in labored, irregular breaths. Dark stains in the sand around the animal suggested blood, and its position, partially curled against the base of a solar panel support, indicated it had sought shade and failed to move for hours, possibly days. The morning sun was already climbing, and within 2 hours, this section of desert would become a furnace. David's military training warred with basic human compassion. Protocol demanded he call wildlife control, maintain safe distance, document the situation. But the veteran in him, the part that had held dying Marines in his arms and promised them they wouldn't die alone, couldn't drive away from a suffering creature, regardless of species. He reached for his satellite phone to call his supervisor, then hesitated. How do you explain finding an African lion in the Mojave Desert without sounding completely insane? And more importantly, how long would it take for help to arrive while the animal suffered in the escalating heat? The lion stirred slightly, and for one impossible moment, David could have sworn it was looking directly at him. David sat frozen in his truck cab, engine idling, air conditioning battling the rising desert heat, while his mind processed an impossible decision. Every instinct screamed at him to maintain distance. This was a wild predator, injured and unpredictable, capable of killing a man with a single swipe of its massive paws. The rational choice was obvious. Call for backup, wait for professionals with tranquilizer guns and proper equipment. Let someone else handle this unprecedented situation. But as he watched the lion's increasingly shallow breathing through his binoculars, another voice emerged from deep within his psyche. The same voice that had compelled him to drag wounded Marines from the kill zone in Helmand Province. The voice that had driven him to risk his own life repeatedly for brothers in arms who needed help. This creature was dying alone in the desert, just as his squad mates had died alone on that dusty road 3 years ago while he lay unconscious, unable to help them. David's hands clenched the steering wheel until his knuckles went white. He had failed his team when it mattered most, survived when better men had died, carried that weight every single day since. The therapists called it survivor's guilt, but David knew it was something deeper, a fundamental failure to fulfill the most basic promise soldiers make to each other. No one gets left behind. The lion shifted again, and a low, barely audible sound carried across the desert air. Not a roar of aggression, but something that sounded almost like a whimper. In that moment, David saw not a dangerous predator, but a fellow creature stranded in hostile territory, abandoned and afraid. The parallel hit him like physical blow. He had been that dying creature, metaphorically speaking, for 3 years. His hand moved to the door handle, then stopped. Opening that door meant abandoning safety, logic, and self-preservation. It meant choosing compassion over common sense, risking his life for an animal that might attack him out of fear or pain. It meant stepping back into the role of protector that had defined his military service, but had been stripped away by trauma and guilt. The desert wind whistled through a gap in the truck window, carrying with it the scent of sage and something else, something that smelled like suffering. David closed his eyes, hearing the echo of his drill instructor's voice from boot camp. Marines don't abandon the mission, and they sure as hell don't abandon each other. When he opened his eyes, his decision was made. David's hand pushed open the truck door, and the desert heat hit him like opening an oven. He moved with the deliberate precision that had kept him alive in Afghanistan, checking his weapon, grabbing the emergency medical kit from behind his seat, filling a collapsible water bowl from his reserve supply. Each action was methodical, automatic, muscle memory taking over where conscious thought might falter. The walk across the 100 yards of rocky terrain felt eternal. His boots crunched on gravel and dried vegetation while sweat already began forming under his tactical shirt. The lion hadn't moved since his approach began, but David could see its eyes now, amber pools reflecting intelligence, and something that looked disturbingly like recognition. Not the vacant stare of a dying animal, but the focused gaze of a creature making its own calculated assessment. At 30 yards, David stopped and called out softly, his voice carrying the same tone he'd used to calm wounded soldiers. "Easy there, big guy. I'm not here to hurt you." The lion's massive head lifted slightly, ears twitching at the sound of human speech. No aggression, no defensive posturing, just watchful attention from an animal that should have been impossible to find in this location. Preparing and narrating this type of story took us long efforts and hard work, so if you are enjoying the story, please consider subscribing to our channel. 20 yards. David could now see the extent of the lion's injuries. Deep lacerations across the left flank, what appeared to be infected bite marks on the shoulder, and, most concerning, signs of severe dehydration in the sunken eyes and dry nose. The animal had been in this desert for days, possibly weeks, somehow surviving in conditions that should have killed it within hours. At 10 yards, David knelt slowly in the sand, placing the water bowl on the ground between them. The lion's nostrils flared, catching the scent of fresh water, but it made no move toward the offering. Instead, those amber eyes remained locked on David's face with an intensity that sent chills down his spine despite the rising heat. "I know you're scared," David whispered, his voice barely audible above the desert wind. "I know you're hurt and far from home. But you don't have to die alone out here." The words surprised him. They were as much for himself as for the lion, acknowledging the isolation both creatures had chosen, the self-imposed exile from their respective worlds. The lion blinked once slowly, and David felt something shift inside his chest. the first crack in the armor he'd built around his heart since returning from war. The lion's condition was far worse than David had initially assessed. As he inched closer, the full extent of the creature's suffering became apparent. The infected wounds were crawling with flies, the dehydration so severe that the lion's breathing had become a labored wheeze. This wasn't just an injured animal. This was a magnificent creature in the final stages of dying, and David realized he was completely out of his depth. His satellite phone finally connected after 3 attempts, the signal weak but functional. Animal Control, this is David Reeves, solar technician at Grid Sector 7. I need to report an unusual situation. The dispatcher's voice crackled through static as David tried to explain finding an African lion in the Mojave Desert without sounding like a heatstroke victim hallucinating. Sir, did you say an African lion in Nevada? The skepticism in the woman's voice was palpable. David described the location, the animal's condition, the urgency of the situation. But bureaucratic wheels turn slowly, even in emergencies. The earliest response team could arrive would be 4 hours. 4 hours during which the desert sun would climb past 115 degrees. Dr. Elena Vasquez at the Las Vegas Zoo's Emergency Wildlife Clinic was David's second call. Her response was immediate and professional. Keep the animal hydrated if possible, create shade, but maintain safe distance. Lions are unpredictable when injured. She explained that the nearest wildlife veterinarian was in Phoenix, 3 hours away minimum, and getting tranquilization equipment to the location would require coordination between multiple agencies. 4 hours minimum. David looked at the lion, whose breathing had become even more labored in just the 20 minutes since he'd arrived. The animal's eyes were beginning to glaze over, a look David recognized from too many battlefield casualties. 4 hours would be 4 hours too late. The lion stirred as David approached with a tarp to create makeshift shade. Instead of retreating or showing aggression, the massive creature did something that defied every wildlife documentary David had ever seen. It lifted its great head with tremendous effort and looked directly into David's eyes, then deliberately turned its gaze toward a cluster of rocks about 50 yards away. The gesture was unmistakable, purposeful, communicative. The lion was trying to show him something, trying to direct his attention to that specific location with the kind of intelligence that suggested this encounter was far from random. David followed the lion's gaze to the rocky outcropping, his combat instincts immediately cataloging the terrain: natural shelter, elevated position, strategic advantage. But as he approached the jumbled boulders, what he discovered defied every assumption he'd made about this impossible situation. Hidden in the shadow of the largest rock formation was a makeshift camp. A torn, military-grade tarp stretched between stones, empty water containers, and scattered remnants of military rations. The MRE packages were recent, their expiration dates showing they were only months old. A faded military dog tag lay half-buried in the sand: Staff Sergeant Miguel Santos, United States Army. David's hands trembled as he read the name, recognizing it from veteran support group meetings he'd attended sporadically after his discharge. Santos had been reported missing 6 months ago after disappearing from a PTSD treatment facility in California. Deeper investigation revealed a journal wrapped in plastic, its pages filled with increasingly erratic handwriting documenting Santos's descent into complete psychological breakdown. The entries painted a picture of a man who had fled civilization entirely, convinced that the world no longer held a place for him. But the final entries told a different story. They described his unlikely partnership with a lion he'd named Courage. According to Santos's journal, he had discovered the lion chained in an abandoned private zoo, part of an illegal exotic animal trafficking operation that had been hastily evacuated when authorities closed in. The lion had been abandoned to die, just as Santos felt he had been abandoned by a society that promised to care for returning veterans. In an act of mutual salvation, Santos had freed the lion, and together they had fled into the desert wilderness. For 3 months, man and beast had survived together in one of America's most unforgiving environments. Santos hunted small game and gathered water from rare desert springs, while the lion provided protection from other predators and, more importantly, companionship for a man who had lost faith in human connection. The journal entries from this period showed a gradual healing in Santos's mental state. Purpose had returned to his life through caring for another broken creature. But the desert had eventually claimed Santos, his body buried under rocks in a shallow grave marked with a crude cross made from solar panel brackets. The lion had remained, unable to hunt effectively alone, slowly starving while keeping vigil over the grave of the only human who had shown him kindness. David knelt beside Santos's grave, the full weight of the tragedy settling over him like the desert heat. The makeshift cross bore crude scratches that spelled out courage. Not the lion's name, but Santos's final message about what their partnership had meant. The journal's last entry, dated 2 weeks ago, was written in a shaking hand. "If anyone finds this, please don't let him die alone. He saved me first." Understanding flooded through David with crystalline clarity. The lion hadn't wandered randomly into the solar field. He had deliberately sought out another human, guided by some instinct that recognized David as someone who might understand the bond between warriors. The animal had traveled miles from Santos's camp, using his remaining strength to find help, not for himself, but to fulfill his dead companion's final wish. David returned to the lion with new purpose, carrying fresh water and the emergency medical supplies from his truck. The animal's condition had deteriorated further, but when David approached, those amber eyes showed a flicker of something that might have been relief. The lion allowed David to clean his wounds with antiseptic, to bandage the worst infections, to pour water slowly into his mouth. Dr. Vasquez arrived 90 minutes ahead of schedule, her helicopter kicking up clouds of red dust as it landed near the solar array. Her team worked with professional efficiency, establishing IV fluids, administering antibiotics, checking vital signs. But even as they worked, David could see the grim assessment in their faces. The lion was beyond saving. Too dehydrated, too infected, too far gone. "We can transport him to the facility," Dr. Vasquez said quietly, "but honestly, the kindest thing would be to let him go peacefully here. He's suffering, and his organs are beginning to shut down." She paused, studying David's face. "The question is whether you want to stay with him. Animals shouldn't die alone." The irony wasn't lost on David. Santos had died alone, despite the lion's presence, and now the lion faced the same fate. But something had changed in David during these hours in the desert. The numbness that had protected him since Afghanistan was giving way to something he'd forgotten how to feel. The simple, profound need to bear witness, to ensure that courage and loyalty were honored even in their final moments. As the sun reached its zenith and the medical team prepared their equipment, David made a decision that surprised everyone, including himself. He asked Dr. Vasquez and her team to step back, to give him and the lion privacy for whatever time remained. The veterinarian hesitated, concerned about safety protocols, but something in David's eyes, a recognition of shared purpose, convinced her to honor his request. Preparing and narrating this type of story took us long efforts and hard work, so if you are enjoying the story, please consider subscribing to our channel. David positioned himself beside the lion's massive head, close enough to feel the labored breathing, close enough to see his own reflection in those fading amber eyes. He began to speak, his voice carrying across the desert wind, telling the lion about Santos, about brotherhood, about the bonds that transcend species and circumstances. He spoke about Afghanistan, about the squad members he'd lost, about the guilt that had driven him to this same desert isolation. "He didn't abandon you," David whispered, his hand gently stroking the lion's mane. "And you didn't abandon him. You both kept faith." The lion's breathing was slowing now, each exhale longer than the last, but those eyes remained focused on David's face, with an intensity that seemed to burn brighter as life ebbed away. Then, in a moment that would haunt and heal David for the rest of his life, the lion summoned his remaining strength for one final act. With tremendous effort, the great cat lifted his massive paw and placed it gently on David's hand. Not a swipe, not an accident, but a deliberate gesture of connection. The weight of that paw, the warmth of it, the impossible gentleness in what should have been a weapon, conveyed everything that words could never express. In that touch, David felt the lion transferring something profound. Not just Santos's story, but a deeper truth about courage, loyalty, and the responsibility to bear witness to both suffering and love. The lion held the contact for nearly a minute, his eyes never leaving David's, until the final breath escaped in a soft sigh that seemed to carry all the desert's ancient wisdom. Dr. Vasquez later said she had never witnessed anything like it in 30 years of wildlife medicine. David arranged for both Santos and the lion to be buried together in the military cemetery outside Las Vegas, two warriors who had found each other in the wilderness and refused to let go, even in death. David returned to work, but something fundamental had changed. The isolation he'd chosen was no longer exile, but preparation for the purpose he'd finally rediscovered. 6 months later, David stood before a different kind of audience than he'd ever imagined addressing. The conference room at the Phoenix Veterans Affairs Medical Center was packed with psychologists, social workers, and fellow veterans, all gathered to hear about an experimental therapy program that had emerged from the most unlikely circumstances. The PowerPoint presentation behind him showed photos of the desert camp, Santos's journal entries, and the remarkable documentation of human-animal bonding in extreme conditions. Project Courage isn't just about animal-assisted therapy, David explained to the attentive crowd. It's about recognizing that healing often comes through serving something greater than ourselves. The program he'd developed paired combat veterans struggling with PTSD with rescued exotic animals, creatures that, like the veterans themselves, had been abandoned, traumatized, or deemed too dangerous for normal society. The first success story was remarkable. Staff Sergeant Maria Chen, who hadn't spoken to another human being in 8 months after losing her unit in Syria, had formed an extraordinary bond with a rescue tiger named Phoenix. The tiger had been seized from an illegal breeding operation, declawed and abused, exhibiting severe behavioral problems that made him unadoptable by traditional standards. Together, Chen and Phoenix had found something neither had possessed alone: purpose in mutual healing. David's work had attracted attention from unexpected quarters. The Department of Veterans Affairs was funding a pilot program, wildlife sanctuaries were partnering to provide rescue animals, and universities were studying the neurological changes in veterans who participated. But the most meaningful endorsement came from Santos's sister, Maria, who had donated her brother's military benefits to establish the Miguel Santos Memorial Fund for veteran animal therapy programs. The lion story had become legend among the veteran community, proof that even in the darkest wilderness, connection was possible, that courage could be transferred from one broken soul to another. David carried Santos's dog tags now, along with his own, and a small vial of sand from the place where 3 lives had intersected in the Nevada desert. Every morning, David woke not to isolation and guilt, but to purpose. The program was expanding to 5 states, with waiting lists of veterans eager to participate. In saving animals that society had written off, these men and women were discovering their own capacity for healing, their own worth beyond the battlefields that had defined them. The desert had taught David that sometimes salvation comes not from forgetting the past, but from honoring it through service to others who understand the weight of survival. David closed his presentation that day with a photograph that never failed to bring tears to his eyes. Santos and the lion captured in the journal's margins, a crude but unmistakable sketch of man and beast sharing water under the desert stars. The drawing had been discovered on the journal's final page, along with 5 words that became the program's motto: "We don't abandon each other." Today, Project Courage operates in 12 states with over 300 veteran animal partnerships. Veterans like Sarah, who found purpose training rescue wolves; Marcus, who nursed an abandoned grizzly cub back to health; and Elena, whose bond with a one-eyed eagle helped her overcome her fear of flying again. Each story echoes the same truth David learned in that Nevada desert. Healing doesn't come from forgetting our scars, but from using them to recognize when others need saving. The original solar array where David found the lion has been designated as a memorial site. A simple bronze plaque marks the spot, reading, "In memory of Staff Sergeant Miguel Santos and Courage, who proved that brotherhood has no boundaries." Visitors often leave small stones, a tradition that began spontaneously among veterans who pilgrimaged to the site. David still works in the desert, but no longer alone. His new role takes him across the country, establishing sanctuary partnerships and training programs. He carries Santos's journal everywhere, its pages now weathered from constant reading, but its message as clear as that first day when desperate amber eyes looked into his and asked for help. The desert taught him that sometimes we must be willing to be saved before we can save others. Sometimes courage comes not from charging into battle, but from simply refusing to let another soul face the darkness alone. If this story moved you, if you believe in second chances for both veterans and the animals who need them, please subscribe to our channel. Share this video with someone who needs to hear that hope exists, even in the most impossible places. Together, we can ensure that no one, human or animal, has to face their battles alone.